Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So Boris Johnson isn't answering any questions about what happened in the early hours of Friday morning when police were called to the London flat he shares with his partner Carrie Simons, after neighbours reported sounds of screaming and shouting. A neighbour who made the call and handed a recording of the incident to the Guardian newspaper told the paper today they hoped anyone would have done the same out of concern for those involved. Minnie Stevenson has this report.
Have you ruined your chances of becoming Prime Minister, Mr Johnson?
The man who wants to be the next Prime Minister. Boris Johnson's strategy so far has been to say little, but increasingly the question being asked of him, why were police called to his partner Carrie Simons' home? On the front page of every major newspaper, reports of a domestic between Boris and his partner. Today, Boris centre stage in Birmingham, facing the Conservative Party members, but avoiding the crucial question.
That there is one subject on everybody's lips today, and they want to know why the police were called to your house in the early hours of Friday morning.
I don't think they want to hear about that kind of thing, unless I'm wrong.
While the crowd then appeared to cheer Boris on, he continued to evade the question. Not once, not twice, but 5 times.
Well, you've just taken up a minute with that answer, which has told us absolutely nothing.
That's okay. Well, look, that's a fair point. And
with respect, you're completely avoiding my question.
Well, I told you I was going to tell.
Does a person's private life have any bearing on their ability to do the job as Prime Minister?
Promises.
It is a very simple question. I think any politician. I shall ask Jeremy Hunt the same question as well. Does a person's private life?
Don't boo! No. Don't boo the great man.
When he answers this question, I will move on.
No.
Does a person's private life have any bearing on their ability to discharge the office of Prime Minister?
Well, I've tried to give my answer pretty exhaustively.
And yet many feel he did not answer that question. While some Conservative Party members questioned our prospective Prime Minister's character, other MPs played it down today.
It's a really odd one, this, because, we all have arguments. If I had a newspaper living next door to my house, they would be picking up the odd ding-dong I have with Mrs Garnier.
The Guardian newspaper who broke the story claimed to have heard a recording of Carrie Simons and Boris Johnson having a screaming row. The newspapers say Carrie can be heard shouting at Boris to get off me and asking him to get out of my flat.
I've just spoken to one of the next-door neighbours who said she'd rather not appear on camera, but told me in the early hours of Friday morning she could hear an argument going on. From inside the flat, she could hear a woman shouting. She said things were being smashed inside. She became worried about the woman's safety, and then the police arrived.
My missus heard stuff, and she gave me a call. She just said she heard lots of shouting and screaming, and some things being smashed or broken. And then there was police.
Not in with some of the neighbours, it would seem. This their own local campaign against the leadership candidate in this safe Labour seat. It follows a difficult week for the Conservative Party after now suspended MP Mark Field was filmed grabbing a protester by the neck.
Can you get this person out?
It's a peaceful protest.
While Boris's critics say he must be able to face uncomfortable scrutiny if he wants to be Prime Minister. Based on today's performance, it looks as though he'll do everything he can to avoid that.
Well, as you saw there, Boris Johnson wouldn't be drawn on his private life, but he did take questions on other issues at the first Conservative leadership hustings in Birmingham today, alongside his rival Jeremy Hunt. Mr Johnson claimed that when he made a promise in politics, I keep that promise and deliver. Mr Hunt described himself as the underdog, but declared he was the man to deliver Brexit and unite the Conservative Party. Kamian Zeram reports.
Mr Johnson, what have you got to say about the alleged altercation in South London the other night?
Whatever the headlines and gossip about his character,
Hello, Boris. Nice to see you. How are you?
It's Tory members, not the wider public, who'll decide whether Boris Johnson is fit to lead the nation.
Mr Johnson, does your character matter to this debate?
The unpredictable Johnson or the opposite in Jeremy Hunt? The first of many grassroots hustings, and believe it or not, there are some who haven't yet made up their minds.
Do you favour one over the other?
No. I think they've both got strong points, both got baggage.
I'm undecided, but I want to find out who's going to be a good listener and listen to the people of the country.
Mr. Johnson's been accused of hiding from scrutiny, but today, no more. Though he flat refused to discuss anything he considered personal, only policy.
So just to be clear, you're not going to make any comment at all on what happened last night?
I think that's pretty obvious from the foregoing.
Top of the agenda, Brexit.
And we must be able to come out on WTO terms so that for the first time in these negotiations we carry conviction. And it's precisely because we will be preparing between now and October the 31st for a no-deal Brexit that we will get the deal we need.
Promises soon followed for more spending on police and education, but also tax cuts. The hustings will tour the country to address regional concerns. Here in the West Midlands, he said he was frankly anxious about HS2 and could only offer a review. But perhaps the detail really is a bit dull, because leadership ultimately is about personality. And here and there, flashes of what makes Mr. Johnson so popular and so divisive.
I love hearing questions from you, but what about more from the audience? I mean,
So personality versus policy. Jeremy Hunt, derided by some as Theresa May Mark II, also putting big tax cuts at the heart of his campaign.
And I'm going to take a giant step to making that happen by a radical cut in corporation tax to 12.5% Irish levels to turbocharge the British economy.
The calculation many members will be making, though, not just how well these two men are in control of their briefs, but who's the better street fighter? For who would ignore the risk of a general election, facing Nigel Farage on the right and Jeremy Corbyn on the left?
Faced with a hard left populist, we could choose our own populist. Or we could do better. We could choose our own Jeremy.
And surely what did for Mrs May might see Mr Hunt off too. Is he not still a Remainer at heart?
Labelling people as Remainer, Brexiteer. We're not going to unite our party, and we're not going to get this vote through the House of Commons. We've got to come together and deliver Brexit.
I'm joined live now by three party members who will choose the next leader and, of course, the next Prime Minister. We'll start with Angela Warner. Now, you were undecided. Where are you now? And given the talk of character, are there still two candidates in this, or has Boris ruled himself out?
Still undecided, still two candidates. I'm hearing what I want to hear about the economy, social justice, so there's a good level playing field there. However, I think this does come down to leadership, comes down to personality.
And style then.
It does, yeah. So the big two things I think that we need a good mix of passion, but you've got to balance that with authenticity. You've got Boris with his passion, can't fault it, the authenticity through his informality, but you're looking at Jeremy and
well, let's talk about Mr Hunt in a minute,
yeah.
Because Charlotte Hodivala, you're a member and a councillor and a Boris camp, firmly in the Boris camp, or at least you were. You're going to tell me that what allegedly happened the other night in London doesn't matter, but there are lots of people in the country who think it does. Why should they believe that Boris is the best person to lead the country?
I don't think character is a matter of whether you ever had an argument with your other half. I don't know any couples who've never had an argument. I think Boris made it very clear in there that's their personal life and that we should respect that. I do think he shows his character in many other ways, and I was particularly impressed with his grasp across many briefs, including county lines. But what I'm heartened at is to see how much our party is now uniting already behind two really strong candidates, and yes, I'm still backing Boris.
So you mentioned policy, and of course, in a sense, Mr Hunt, that's his strong suit. Takir Hussain, also a member. Your challenge, if we're talking character, your guy, well, he's a bit dull, isn't he?
Well, no, I couldn't agree with that. I mean, just before we came to this debate, Jeremy Hunt went to the heart of Sparkhill with us and went to one of my favourite curry houses, Imran's restaurant. He got into the local people, he learned about the culture, he sat down and he even cooked us a bounty and a naan. So I think it's more, for Jeremy, it's more getting that more publicised. He does it off the cuff, he does it with the normal people.
So he does have personality. Look, let's drill this down to the person, in a sense, that both of you have got to persuade, you in a sense more. Angela, does this come down, ultimately, in terms of policy, does it come down to Brexit?
No,
There's more to it.
It comes down to style and leadership style. Hunt is all about that comment that he made, that don't mistake British politeness for British weakness.
That you like that.
I like that.
He does have personality.
That does appeal.
To our three voting members, thank you for joining us, and back to you in the studio, Fatima.
Thanks very much, Kemi. Well, joining me now is Peter Kellner, the former president of the polling agency YouGov. Peter, thanks for coming in. First of all, Boris Johnson, on the front of every newspaper, has refused to answer questions. Is it going to make any difference whatsoever as to how the Tory membership sees him?
Not yet. But look, going back of recent decades, private lives, they've excited the tabloids far more than they've worried the wider public. Cecil Parkinson in the 1980s, cabinet minister, had to resign because his mistress had a child. It became a scandal. The following election, his majority locally went up by 3,000. Early weeks of 1992, Paddy Ashdown all over the tabloids having had an affair. A few weeks later, general election. His majority went up, guess what? By 3,000. Boris's own private life hasn't held him back. However, and there is a however here, if over the tomorrow Sunday papers over the next few days, if the narrative shifts from simply about his private life to a wider character issue, is he unprincipled? Is he erratic? Is he a bit dodgy? If the allegations widen and take hold, that could cause him trouble.
So we could see more trouble tomorrow, potentially.
Depends what's in the Sunday papers.
It is interesting, though, because this is a Conservative party, the party seen as the traditional family values champion, and yet you still think it might not make a difference if it is purely about his personal life.
No, in my quite long lifetime, things have changed. Race, sexuality, things like this, they matter very little politically. They sometimes make big news stories. Hypocrisy matters. Dodgy financial dealings matter. Dishonesty matters. If politicians are caught out misbehaving in those areas, it's trouble. But honestly, private lives on their own don't matter very much.
Now, it's the Conservative membership who decides here, but can we talk about the wider electorate? If there's a possibility of a general election soon, do we think there's enough time for the Conservative Party and the Labour Party to recover what they have lost previously in the European election?
Heaven knows, if there's a general election this autumn, because Parliament gets stuck on Brexit, it's deadlocked, and there's an October or November election, the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage, will be out there saying, Brexit hasn't been delivered, vote for us. We've had a big surge of the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives are in trouble, Labour's in trouble. So you've got a sort of unstable four-party competition in a first-past-the-post election system. And Fatima, I wouldn't have a clue to within 100 seats what any party will get. I mean, it would be the most extraordinary general election campaign I can remember.
And what's your polling showing you about what the public generally think about both of these candidates?
Boris Johnson is a lot more popular than Jeremy Hunt. However, a lot of that is because Boris Johnson is much more known than Jeremy Hunt. It will be very interesting over the next 2 or 3 weeks as Jeremy Hunt gets roughly equal airtime as Boris Johnson, as the public get to know him, whether that gap will start to narrow. But at the moment, Boris is ahead.
We're going to have to keep a close eye on it. Peter Kellner, thank you very much.
Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt have been making their pitch to Conservative Party members in the first of 16 hustings to choose the next Conservative leader and ultimately Prime Minister. At the event in Birmingham, Mr Johnson avoided answering questions about why the police were called to the flat he shares with his partner on Thursday night. Well, here's our political correspondent, Vicky Young.
Have you ruined your chances of becoming Prime Minister, Mr Johnson? Mr Johnson, why were police outside your house last night?
He's been accused of hiding from scrutiny, avoiding detailed answers about his policies on Brexit and tax.
I cannot hide it from you that we meet in dark days for our party, and I have never known us to be down at 17 points in the polls.
Today the questions were more personal, as Boris Johnson faced hundreds of Conservative Party members and was asked why police had been called to his flat in the early hours of Friday morning.
I don't think they want to hear about that kind of thing, unless I'm wrong. I think, forgive me, I think what they want to hear, is what my plans are for the country and for our party.
Police were called to the flat Boris Johnson shares with his girlfriend Carrie Simmons after neighbours reported hearing an angry row and were concerned about her welfare. A neighbour passed on a recording to the Guardian newspaper. It's reported a woman could be heard screaming and saying, "Get off and get out of my flat." The Metropolitan Police told the BBC there was no cause for police action. So what about questions of character? Would Mr Johnson answer that?
Does a person's private life...
Don't boo! No, don't boo the great man.
When he answers this question, I will move on.
No.
Does a person's private life have any bearing on their ability to discharge the office of Prime Minister?
Well, look, I've tried to give my answer pretty exhaustively.
On Brexit, he said he was determined to take the UK out of the EU by October the 31st.
What I said was that leaving on October the 31st was, my words were eminently feasible. Which was taken to mean that I wasn't 100% determined to do it. Eminently feasible means it's not only that we are going to do it, but it's possible.
Up next, the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. He campaigned to remain during the referendum. Now he wants to lead a pro-Brexit party. So could he be trusted to deliver?
If we got to the 31st of October and the EU have not shown any willingness to negotiate a better deal that can get through the House of Commons, that's not going to trap us in the customs union, then my judgment is that weighing those difficult options up, the political risk of no Brexit is far worse than the economic risk of no deal.
And what about his character? Did he have the charisma and steel to be a Prime Minister?
Some people would say he's too nice.
I think it's possible to be very polite and very tough. And I think my track record shows some very difficult industrial disputes that I had at the Department of Health. The advantage of the politeness is that people will talk to you, but by golly, I hope they don't underestimate you, because I'm going to get that deal.
There will be 15 more of these hustings before Conservative members choose our next Prime Minister. Plenty of time for more questions.
Now, Boris Johnson has never answered questions about his private life, and listening to that, it's pretty clear that he's not going to start doing so now. I think those in his team would point to the cheers in the room, the backing from those Conservative Party members who felt that he was right to take that approach. Speaking to people as they came out, Boris Johnson's supporters talked about his charisma, the way he could communicate with people, his rock star quality. There's no doubt others, though, do know that he could be a risky option. But the state of the Conservative Party means that many may well be willing to take that risk. Against that, Jeremy Hunt portraying himself as the calm, sensible, mature man who can get the job done without any of the drama.
Vicky, thank you. Boris Johnson's sometimes colourful private life took centre stage again today as he bid to become the next Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister. He blanked questions about what happened at the flat he shares with his girlfriend after a neighbour heard a row and called police. This afternoon, in front of an audience of party faithful, Mr Johnson repeatedly refused to explain events when asked about the incident. Some party members applauded that, but others said it raises legitimate questions about the character of a man who could soon be the leader of the country. Our political correspondent Romilly Weeks reports.
His strategy so far has been to say as little as possible.
Have you ruined your chances of becoming Prime Minister, Mr Johnson? Mr Johnson?
But the questions are building for Boris Johnson after his late-night encounter with the police. At the first leadership hustings in Birmingham, he refused 4 times to answer questions about what happened.
I don't think they want to hear about that kind of thing, unless I'm wrong. I think
the audience clearly behind him.
I think what they want to hear, is what my plans are for the country and for our party.
If the police are called to your home, it makes it everyone's business. You are running for the office of not just leader of the Conservative Party, but Prime Minister.
Most people would really rather judge my ambitions and my character and my programme.
So just to be clear, you're not going to make any comment at all on what happened last night?
I think that's pretty obvious from the foregoing.
Okay.
Tory members here might be sympathetic, the papers not so. Every front page covering the alleged bust-up between him and his girlfriend at her London flat that led to a neighbour calling police in the early hours. Another resident also heard the row.
My missus heard stuff and she gave me a call.
And what did she say?
She just said she heard lots of shouting and screaming and some things being smashed or broken. And then there was police.
The police say no offence was committed. Mr Johnson has been in a relationship with this woman, Carrie Simmons, since he separated from his wife of 25 years. Tory members at a grassroots event today told me his personal life would not affect how they'll vote.
Of course, you do have to take into account what you mentioned, personal conduct, of course. However, at this stage, in terms of the way things stand, I think Boris is our best hope.
Do you think that the personal conduct of a potential Prime Minister is a fair subject for scrutiny?
Yeah, I do agree. Of course, you have to look at their personal life, but then I also think what makes Boris is that he is relatable.
Boris's personal life is just that, Boris's personal life. Everyone has had fights with their partner. Yes, a neighbour in this instance apparently called the police, but that neighbour also called the Guardian newspaper.
His rival Jeremy Hunt made no mention of Boris Johnson's troubles, but some of his backers were less charitable.
He has in the past caused quite a lot of havoc in his wake, both at home and abroad. And so any Boris Johnson Prime Ministership would be pretty helter-skelter. And I think that we need something that is dependable and reliable and competent.
Jeremy Hunt did urge Boris Johnson to commit to more questioning than the ITV leaders' debate that both have signed up to, suggesting he must be able to face uncomfortable scrutiny. Mr Johnson, on today's evidence, looks as though he'll do everything he can to avoid more of that.
So, Romilly, just how damaging could this be for Mr Johnson?
Well, it's undoubtedly uncomfortable for him, not least because it allows renewed attention on his private life, which his critics have always pointed to as evidence that he doesn't have the character required for the highest office, his affairs, his relationship with the truth, even the number of children that he has. However, what was really interesting about the hustings today, as you heard in my report there, was how supportive the audience were of him, how supportive they were of him not answering the questions. This is a group who doesn't like to be blown off course, not least by what they would see as the left-leaning media, and they certainly lapped up his pitch that he is the person who can win elections and deliver Brexit. Some MPs, though, are rather more circumspect. One of his backers, who I spoke to today, suggested that if there is more to come out on this tomorrow, if the newspapers are holding anything back, then at that point, the Boris Johnson campaign, which has been so disciplined and so effective up until this point, could really be in trouble.
OK, Romilly, thank you very much.
For the first time in his political career, an appearance from Boris Johnson was remarkable for the things he didn't say. The frontrunner in the Conservative leadership contest flatly refused to explain why the police were called to his home in the early hours of Friday morning. But many in the audience didn't seem to mind, booing the moderator for asking the question and applauding Mr Johnson's promises to get Brexit done. Jeremy Hunt also said that if necessary, he was prepared to leave the European Union on October the 31st without a deal, albeit with a heavy heart. Our political editor Beth Rigby reports.
Have you ruined your chances of becoming Prime Minister, Mr Johnson? Mr Johnson, why were police outside your house last night?
Questions that need answering, but Mr Johnson refusing to oblige. Beginning the final stages of his bid to be PM under the cloud of newspaper headlines about a domestic incident at his girlfriend's flat.
There is one subject on everybody's lips today, and they want to know why the police were called to your house in the early hours of Friday morning.
I don't think they want to hear about that kind of thing, unless I'm wrong. I think...
You've just taken up a minute with that answer, which has told us absolutely nothing. Does a person's private life have any bearing on their ability to discharge the office of Prime Minister? Well, so just to be clear, you're not going to make any comment at all on what happened last night?
I think that's pretty obvious from the foregoing. Yeah.
The room sympathetic on this one, not so much on other policy and character questions.
In June last year, during a Foreign Office reception, you were asked about corporate concerns regarding a hard Brexit. You replied, business. Is your attitude towards British jobs still as cavalier and as careless as it obviously was then.
I'm the most passionately pro-business Conservative politician you could hope to meet, and I've never known one single stray, distorted remark wrenched out of context.
A political rock star for sure, but the quieter continuity candidate, Jeremy Hunt, also trying to show he has the personality and policy to lead.
They're running a campaign to help me find the slogan that I should be putting to the country and to the membership, and we've had hashtag take a punt on Hunt, hashtag Jezzas the Bezza, and hashtag Hunty McHuntface. Now be very, very careful how you say that one, because we're the party of family values.
But he has to battle the perception that he isn't a true Brexit believer.
Why should they support someone who didn't vote Leave and just doesn't feel it in your gut the same way that they do?
Oh, yes, I do. Look at my record. Look at my record since that referendum. I have been very clear on every occasion that we needed to fight hard to get the best possible deal from the European Union, and I have voted for Brexit.
The Foreign Secretary true to his word that he wants a clean fight.
I'm not going to talk about his private life, but I do think he should stand on a stage and debate me before members get their ballots in the post, because, you know, we need a proper debate.
The clear underdog, his only hopes to win over the heads, if not the hearts.
I came in quite sure I was going to be pro-Boris, but I thought we had that kind of dichotomy between Boris being the kind of cult of personality, and he was obviously very well received, very funny, but then Jeremy seemed a lot more hot on the detail and a lot more policy-driven.
I kind of think that Boris would probably do more for the country in lots of different ways.
Most here agree with Boris Johnson when it comes to his private life, but this was a warm rather than ecstatic reception for Mr Johnson today. Mr Hunt started this runoff as an also-ran. He'll leave Birmingham with more of a spring in his step. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Birmingham.
I've been getting